Hello, and welcome to APICS Extra Live, the rise of the supply chain executive, with Brian Meadows and Herb Schul. My name is Christopher Jablonski, and I'll be your host for today's broadcast. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and will be available at apics.org/extra starting early next week. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a few details. At the end of the presentation, we'll save time for a question and answer session. If you look at the right toolbar on your screen, you'll see a questions box. To ask your question at any time during the presentation, simply type it in the box and click Send. Should you experience any technical difficulties during today's broadcast, please call GoToWebinar Tech Support at 1-805-617-7000. Our presenters today are Brian Meadows and Herb Schul of America's Advisory Supply Chain at Ernst & Young. So please join me in welcoming Brian and Herb.
Thank you, Christopher, and good afternoon, everyone. Both Herb and I are delighted to be here and to join you to talk about this topic. Before I begin, just give you a quick synopsis of both our backgrounds here. My background is I've got a 30-year career in supply chain operations, both in consulting as well as in operations, running supply chain for wireless companies and pharmaceutical companies. And Herb is a partner of mine who we work together on in supply chain transformation work, but particularly Herb's expertise and leadership is in procurement transformation. And so with that brief introduction, let me provide you a little context to this topic, and in perhaps a little more bias that it shapes certainly my point of view, and you can take that for, as you listen to this discussion this afternoon, as a lens to evaluate the thoughts that we're sharing with you. But with that, what my background is in operations, I recall one of the things that became very interesting to me when I was in the role of leading up the operations for Nextel Communications. The challenge that we have in certain companies and industries is the role of supply chain executive in the strategic decision-making and also in balancing the strategic trade-offs between the sales, marketing, and finance organization. And what I quickly learned, especially being on the operating side after being in consulting for many years, is the need to focus in on the strategic side of the business. And so when I got in, I started this career about over 10 years ago in operations. And so when I got into this business, one of the things that sort of is struck us, especially that I'm now running the supply chain operations for Ernst & Young, is the quick introductions of the transition of the operating executive in a more pervasive way across all industries, where the strategic leadership and the demands of strategic leadership in the operating world became much more important. And I thought, that topic, and that's the basis for why this topic shaped the form that it has while we're sharing it with you. And we thought we'd share some more insight with what does that mean for you as you look at your respective roles and careers and the things that you do day in, day out, to take this as an opportunity to enhance your strategic leadership and operational impact that you have in your clients or the companies you're working for. So with that sort of brief introduction, let me get you a kind of overview of our agenda that we'd like to share with you on the topic. I'd like to, Herb and I would like to spend for a few minutes here first talking about what's the drivers of this renewed focus. And as we talk about the drivers of this focus, we want to be able to talk about what's sort of the heart of the operational transformation that's occurring right now in industries and in general for the supply chain operating executives. Then I'd like to talk and shift a little bit more about the details of the key levers and talk specifically about the things, what does it mean to you in the various elements of improvement areas that you may be working in, to help then shape that as an opportunity for evolving not just your career, but also the strategic leadership role in how companies operate and execute. Christopher, I want to make sure we're shifting the pages correctly, and if you can move on to the slide 2.
Yes, this is slide 1, of course. Let me see if I can make. All right, you should have controls again.
Okay, thank you.
But let me know if you need me to flip, and I'll flip.
That's fine. So let's on this next slide here. Before we get into the details, let's just give you kind of the key top line summary. Interesting today when you think about supply chain today. Most of the efforts that we have today for most companies, they're at the end of the day, it's all about forecast-driven operations. And when you think about the forecast driving every element from the buy, make, move, plan, and deliver activities, the slack that is creating the system, obviously in of itself creates opportunities for improvement just simply because of the change in demand or the change in customer profile and or the change in product profile. And when you think about what the future supply chain is, the technology itself, the globalization, the attributes of evolving towards sensing and reacting to demand in a real-time basis that ultimately drives decision making in the supply chain provides sort of another dimension of where supply chain is going down the road, that both of which have very interesting implications for a business. But the heart of it at the end of the day is driving productivity improvements that allow businesses to enable growth by fueling investment opportunities in various areas that either into reaching new markets that supply chains are expected to deliver to and or look at the supply chains themselves to tailor them to the segments they're serving in such a manner that drives another level of productivity, either through working capital, cost productivity, that shapes the opportunities for the supply chains and the businesses overall to respond to the business opportunities ahead. So when you think about just the dynamic of the forecast-driven model and driving productivity improvements, when 4 years ago you think about how demand's changed dramatically for most companies, you think about that future, the essence of ultimately shaping the business and how it operates in a very unique way. And so the needs to become more strategic with how to leverage this either the platform for driving productivity and or the nature of supply chain in the future has changed and puts greater demand on the strategic elements of how the supply chain executive sits at the table and reacts to these business opportunities or provides opportunities for them. So what does that mean? Well, at the end of the day, we've always talked about integrated supply chain, and we talk about end-to-end, but this is when it becomes crucial and critical and becoming more germane to the essence of what is the key element of this agenda. Another part is the notion of customer centricity. The notion today where the drivers say where customer supply chains become segmented to serving select customer segments, which have implications on the product life cycle, whether it's mature and or just newly launched, all of which creates sort of a very different dynamic in the differentiations of supply chains that need to be designed to meet customers in a very unique way that have historically been more regionally driven and or business product driven. So to take that opportunity to the next level, that's to us what's sort of the basic of what this discussion is about and what we want to now dig into in a little bit more detail. So let's talk a little bit more about these drivers. If you go back to 2009 and 2008, when there was a very significant change in demand, and when you look at the capital constraints that most businesses have today, the whole changing profile of the business today has changed quite remarkably. If I go back even 30 years ago when I started my career in this area of supply chain operations, it's in the past growth has always been driven from the revenue side. But now growth, to enable growth and to get positions for companies positioned to actually attack growth opportunities, the supply chain becomes a very critical element to achieving that. Another key element that's sort of changing the dynamics of supply chains today, and it deals with particularly with the changing growth in the middle class across the third world countries that are serving, and is principally on the manufacturing side, are supply chains. That dynamic of the growing middle class is putting very significant demands on the cost of goods and manufacturing costs in a manner that typically in the past were the basis for a lot of the evolution of contract manufacturing, third-party manufacturing in various parts of the world, where today those costs and the role of technology have changed the dynamic of where productivity has been actually been had in the supply chain. And then in the last point, dealing with technology in of itself, many of the attributes that we hear about with leading practices and so forth that kind of define excellence in supply chain, frankly have been discussed for the last 20 years, 15 years. Technology today is caught up in such a manner where the technology is matching those capabilities. And so today, when you think about what is truly world-class and leading-edge supply chain, it's not necessarily the practices themselves. It's how those practices have been dovetailed to enable the supply chains to become more effective and to meet the customer requirements and the business needs themselves. So when you think about those dimensions, we'll drive what we believe is the essence of one of the key elements here of driving a strategic agenda for supply chain executives.
Hey, Brian, just an add to that, I think as we look at that technology component, the ability to have visibility, manage the supply chain at realistically any point in time from any device, from any location, I think continues to play into that as well.
Another dimension that I find personally interesting is when we work with our clients, a lot of times the challenges and the operating team is geared and oriented to executing the demands of the commercial side of the business, working within the constraints of the finance side of the business. And that responsive role has sort of been an evolution that has evolved since that, our area in supply chain has evolved from a variety of back office processes and operations to where now it's been combined and leveraged into a more of a holistic way the business operates. And that responsive mode has been sort of the germane element that sort of set the stage for the opportunity to move into more strategic relationships with the businesses themselves. But at the same time, it sort of set the cultural side of how companies operate and respond to supply chain or the various components of supply chain. But then when you think about the demands, the triggers we just talked about, and you think about the evolution of supply chain becoming more demand-driven, customer-centric, and to the point where segmented supply chains become the focal point that shape the multiple supply chains that companies that have in place or will be evolving to as globalization becomes more real to, especially global companies, of course. The need to then move into the strategic side of the leadership is becoming germane to success. Ultimately,
yeah,
go ahead.
Brian, I was just going to throw out, if we look at an example from a CPO's seat or a distribution outbound product supply distribution manager's perspective, it's not just looking at, to your point, a supply chain. It's multiple supply chains segmented based on the customer needs, the customer demands, customer requirements, and it's truly looking all the way back from supply to the product or the service being in the hands of the end customer, regardless of the various pieces of the supply chain in between. So I think that's a level of complexity that gets tossed in here as well.
Excellent. So dealing with this opportunity, what not just executives, but anyone in supply chain, how to respond to this opportunity, the shift in responsibilities. At the end of the day, it is about how you find your sense of accountability. Every one of us in supply chain, whether you're a materials planner, manufacturing planning, dealing with sourcing, procurement planning, materials planning, all the various components of supply chain, we have a sense that we know what our accountability is in our respective areas of responsibility. One of the demands to help expand and extend your ability to get into that strategic realm to the extent that there's a gap and there's an opportunity for moving into strategic execution. The way I look at this and the way we look at companies to develop their ability is how to seek accountability. And there are a couple of elements of how you can do that. One is staying focused on a key strategic initiative that you may not be directly involved with, but has direct, where your function or supply chain plays a very important role in the success of a transformation or key initiative that affects customers' expectations. Another element idea here is dealing with making sure that you're seeking opportunities to engage and connect with other, an enterprise initiative that has supply chain as an enabler for success, maybe not necessarily in the near term, but certainly in the future term, that allows you to become more connected to another key strategic dimension or key initiative that's going on in business. So it's not isolating yourself to stay focused to your core area, but it's extending yourself out and making the investment of time to allow yourself to get more strategically involved or more involved with strategic events or initiatives within your company. And I'll give you an example of that. One of when I first took over and led supply chain for Nextel, one of the key initiatives that we had an issue that came in play that dealt with our network operations, where we had failure points in the network outages. And although my organization didn't have direct accountability for operating the network, but to be as tuned when you have the network being when it's down, when the network was going down, being engaged with the network operating team to understand what's going on, to understand then what are the services and what are the things that we need to do from a support standpoint to mitigate either emergency situations with a network outage and or from materials, getting suppliers and or engineering support behind the repairing the situation at hand, was a great example that I use personally to stay attentive to the business and also be allowing ourselves to get ourselves more into the core strategy and also the customer expectations of the wireless experience. Another key way to respond to the business, in a manner that allows you to evolve and develop your strategic execution profile and evolution and leadership, is to be very attentive to the feedback loops. As it relates to customer experience and performance, again, we like to extend ourselves on the customer as the focal point in our supply chain strategies and ultimately how we execute our supply chain performance. And to understand what's going on in the supply chain so the commercial side of the business understands, for an example, what issues are or the dynamics of the supply chain, the supplier operations, supply chain operations interface with customers, to be able to provide opportunities to fill voids with either managing and proactively dealing with customers to respond to the situations that may be occurring, or more importantly, the moment that product development is rolling out new products, to be able to become more engaged in that process in the various parts of your business, in your teaming across supply chain, to be able to support the effective rollouts. Many times, a not understanding the consequences of what's going on in the business day in, day out does prohibit the business to become proactive. And at the end of the day, if we're truly driving, as I described early on, real-time responsiveness to demand, if you take that as a core theme of where supply chains in the future is going, how you then work around that concept, to me, is important to you to executing the strategic leadership to your functions, as it is to understand the consequences of what breakpoints or decisions that are being made in the day in, day out of a business.
Brian, one of your comments there around the operating and financial consequences, I think if we play out an example there where we may be meeting our plan and we may be driving certain criteria or the supply chain at a local market level, that we think about from a supply decision perspective, in many cases, we truly need to understand those consequences so that we can, in some cases, manage constraints and understand the implications of those constraints from an overall profitability. So we may be, we may have a constraint that would change the way we would normally react if we were thinking about the consequences in a profitability lens versus just a meeting demand in a certain lane lens or something along those lines. So I think that second bullet there is really key.
Agreed. Let's get into the key levers that really do have a key impact on improving supply chain performance. And let's put a little context behind this. One of the challenges that we have clearly on the delivery, on the product, on the supply chain execution standpoint, you pretty much know what's the impact on the business when you lose a customer and/or product has not been able to be delivered as expected. Customer service levels deteriorate, and you lose customers. But at the end of the day, the challenge in supply chain is to quickly be able to equate to value and value enhancements to the business. It's very quick to understand value deterioration in an enterprise when you have a stumble, and it's those stumbles in effect becomes the essence of what we're trying to minimize, the unplanned events, and how do we manage through that. And so if you kind of look at the series of points that we wanted to get to here is what are the things that minimize stumbles that quickly get the ire of the various parts of the business, and not having the 2 o'clock in the morning phone call because a customer needs an emergency order that wasn't shipped the night before, to a problem when a product was being launched and you have to announce to Wall Street that the product is a key product launch has been deferred because of not having materials or parts not fitting, and as a result you've got a 2 or 3 month delay. These impacts can have very meaningful impact on, significant impact on a business. So when we start looking at how do you get around and how do you manage around that, we thought we'd spend a few more minutes on this topic. And so I'd like to direct you onto our first topic. Dealing with the standardization. One of the key opportunities that we're seeing across the clients we work with is the opportunity for standardizing processes globally. Many of the operating processes we work with our clients on to improve productivity and performance have a regional business orientation to them, and more importantly, have the data and systems information design behind them that tend to be unique and prohibit a lot of transparency of what's really going on in the business. So the first key lever that has a very significant impact in driving the supply chain performance, as we see it, is how global processes are standardized. And the starting point in making this happen starts with data, the information, and the governance of that data. I think it's quite apparent, the benefits that you get from that, but it's from whether you look at it from a planning standpoint, integrated business planning, to dealing with procurement and driving greater scale advantages through the spend side of the business. Having greater visibility globally and also being able to understand globally the demand is certainly the key gate that's required to evolve to this notion of being able to be more instantaneously responsive to demand at any one point in time.
Brian, you mentioned on the previous page kind of the strategic and visibility components of that. I would also add in the perspective from evaluating, monitoring, and having that common syntax around risk management and all the components of risk that we see not only internal to our four walls, but leading into this slide into our supply base and our overall supplier relationships. I think one of the biggest changes that we see from a supply chain executive anywhere within the organization is really the change from not just evaluating supplier relationships and looking at cost. Cost continues to be one of our large drivers at the CPO level, the category manager, the buyer level, et cetera. And not only do we need to have that common syntax to be managing the scorecard of our partners and doing operating reviews and things we've traditionally seen, but we really are seeing moving past just those items and really starting to look at how do we integrate, how do we collaborate, how do we develop our overall supply network, our overall supply base, and really seeing that drive in leading class organizations, kind of the increased product innovation, increased service organization, an ongoing shared, not only minimize cost or reduce cost, but minimize risks across the portfolio of various risks not just those big events, but those stability and consistency risks that drive variability into the process. And then I think finally, really, as the bullet point here goes into, is understanding the drivers and the levers that we can pull both from a collaborative relationship with the supply base and to ourselves that allows the work to get done in a more efficient, more effective, and more customer-centric approach across the different enterprises that are involved. So this one's a big one for me, and we spend a lot of time talking with organizations and at all levels and all processes within the organization around supplier relationship management.
Next, let's talk about the information. You know, the standardized processes and getting standard data in place is, as I mentioned early on, is one of the key starting points to leveraging standardized processes. Now, the key next lever that's natural in this evolution is how to refine that and leverage the supply chain visibility that you can get from the information for reporting purposes. And one of the biggest elements that I'm sure we can all relate to is the fact that in supply chain being sort of in the nerve fiber of the business, interfaces with so many different functions. And even though, as I discussed it in the past, I talk about where supply chain executive is typically responsible for 100 processes, but have accountability for 100 processes, but have responsibility for hundreds of processes because of the broad set of functional processes that go on, whether it's in product development, marketing, sales. In some cases, it could be in the order fulfillment, customer service, all the things in promotions, all the things that become outside the core of a business, and how to get more visibility to that so that you become more integrated in how you work as a business and more integrated with supply chain to become more aligned with delivering the value ultimately to your customers. So to make that happen and leverage information, it does require breaking down the silos, and it gets back to the ideas that we shared early on, which is this notion of allowing yourself to get engaged and become connected to other strategic initiatives, whether it's just through social and personal connections, but networking yourself so that you can help and enable these breakdown of silos to not just get the cultural norms set up where you become more integrated how you work, but the people side become culturally more understanding how to work together and understand each other's areas, and ultimately so that this information in the decision-making itself becomes effectively more integrated as a company as a whole. Obviously, when you think about this integration and breaking silos, I mean, the key areas that come to mind are product development and customer fulfillment operations, or order fulfillment, and sales and how when you start getting these teams together to dealing with the managing the understanding of demand and how that impacts the product relative to the product life cycle, whether it's early stage or late stage, and as well as looking at new products as they're being rolled out to understand the puts and takes with understanding within the constraints of the operations. That's where you start really getting into elevating again that strategic leadership role, but more importantly ensuring that the system, the complexity of the system doesn't get over encumbered, or the costs associated with that don't become excessive. That doesn't allow for the efficiency, most efficient way of how you operate. So between operating cost savings as well as from a working capital standpoint, and obviously the opportunities to either anticipate or shaping that demand and how you satisfy the demand, those are the implications and benefits that come about by leveraging the information that's available. Another key topic that I find interesting, and maybe this comes back to a bias, many of us in our area have a tendency to focus on cost. And and I go back in the last year, I can think of two major chemical companies and a pharmaceutical company speaking with a CFO about their operations and this person's agenda, each one of their CFO's agendas and what they were looking for in their business. I had a tendency to come in there and focus on the cost. And I recall in these three particular companies, to bring them up because I found it fascinating that in each case they said, look, this isn't about cost, about looking at their supply chain transformation. This is about retaining their most important customers. And it sort of tripped the wire in my mind thinking about, too, the notion that many times in our business we talk about the revenue side and the cost side of what we do, but at the same time being very attentive to that customer experience in making it easy for our customers to do business with us is kind of the underlying theme here, and that does play a very important role, but also making sure that when you understand the service levels, that you're committed to it. If, doing 65%, hitting 65% of whatever key metric you may be having relative to 99% maybe target or 95% target performance, it's understanding what's sort of going on in that dynamic and what are the commitments are made, what are the things that are going on, the nuances and how the system is set up and actually managing that system is something to make sure you become more aware of. To ultimately be very attentive and focused around that customer experience satisfaction. And as we all can relate to, all of us can probably have a tendency to want to do business with people that make it easy for you to do business with. And I think focusing on that customer experience to me is a key element of that lever that helps drive our performance in supply chain. I described early on as a kickoff this discussion about key levers, the focus around stumbles. There was a study done by a professor from Georgia Institute of Technology on this topic, and in supply chain, if supply chain were to continue on an annual basis, if once a year there was a major stumble where new product was not shipped on time and you had to make an announcement, there's anything associated with missed deliveries, product performance, the deterioration of enterprise value, as the study was done based on stock prices, and there was a whole interesting study in of itself on that was, assumptions behind this. But the average deterioration in enterprise value as a result of that was typically in the order of between 4 and 7%, where whatever the lost value was had on the business, it was systemic and it sustained itself, which has a very significant impact on, obviously, shareholder lens on their businesses, each of your businesses. So when you think about it, and you deal with those stumbles, the need to be driving reliability and predictability, not just which typically has been the centerpiece in manufacturing, but across the supply chain becomes a very important part of our strategy. In some cases, it could very well be the criterion for prioritizing key improvement initiatives within the supply chain operations, how you drive reliability and or predictability. From a CFO lens, there's no question that that's very near and dear to their part. And from a shareholder perspective, the ability to minimize downside, even though it may not be evident as I talk about showing the value of supply chain, but it certainly is when you have a problem, you can avoid them. Being predictable and reliable becomes a very important centerpiece driving supply chain performance.
So I'll jump in, Brian. I think this next lever is another one that's kind of near and dear to my heart. As you talked about, getting that consistency and that predictability. We spend a lot of time, and traditionally in the supply chain executive, as you say, we tend to think about the cost side of the equation, but eliminating that variability allows us to really take a hard look at that 4 to 7% that we're not going to see degenerate. So the same thing is true in this next level, where we look at should we be the experts in everything? Where have we outsourced? Where does someone else have the expertise? And where should we be looking somewhere else in our network to take advantage of their core competencies? Conversely, I think over the last 5 years, we've started to see, because of technology that we talked about earlier, and because of some of the global dynamics and global economics, we're really starting to see a hard look at potential insourcing of capabilities that previously we would have looked for someone else to potentially do for us. Some of the things that I would say from a supply chain seat really be taking a look at is, as you're looking at those outsourcing deals, are we utilizing this lever in order to meet a significant budget gap? Are we looking at it to meet a specific capability gap? And which of those trade-offs make sense for us? We are seeing short-term deal structures versus a more long-term deal structure that we saw in the past. So evaluate the capability much like you would any other network component, and just like we're seeing network optimization happening on a much more frequent basis and integrated with sourcing on an almost real-time basis in some cases, we're seeing the same thing happen with deal structures when we're looking at bringing things in and the ability to take them back out at some point and leverage various competencies. Finally, I would say, we're looking at how do I align the operating desire to ensure those short-term gains, but make sure that we're not building a cost structure into the long term that we don't have the ability to variabilize, we don't have the ability to manipulate if the various market factors, customer factors, and other data points that we use to determine our supply chain agility change. So I think this is an important piece that, regardless of the chair you're sitting in, as you think about leveraging the rest of the network and looking at insourcing versus outsourcing those complex transactions that all of our organizations are doing, these are some key insights and things to think about, things we're seeing in the market, and truly looking at aligning that overall operating metrics across the board with the cost reductions as well.
Next up, let me close in on the last key lever we wanted to highlight here, which is dealing with the unexpected. One of the very interesting aspects that is becoming much more integrated to our activities is risk management, whether it's an enterprise risk and or supply risk, operational risk. Interestingly enough, there's an emerging demand for hedging risk products, with financial institutions getting involved in creating products to help companies and provide ways to hedge against and insurance products that allow companies to deal with protect themselves of the financial downside with unexpected risk in the business. And so planning for that unexpected and being thoughtful with being proactive in managing the unplanned events, so to help to drive greater predictability to minimize, to maximize your performance in either reliability or responsiveness that your business needs, is a very important lever that we want to close in on here. And thinking, it could be certainly dealing with the changes that occurred with, customer order changes and things that naturally happen, but it could also be dealing with unforeseen events that go on outside your business that have a huge impact on ultimately your customer's experience and or meeting customer expectations. So the last point we wanted to key in on, though, is this notion of planning for the unexpected, driving greater predictability and minimizing the deterioration of typical enterprise value when you do have unplanned stumbles in your supply chain operations. I started, as I mentioned early on, I started out my career in this business 30 years ago, and I recall, growing from talking about distribution, warehousing, transportation, to logistics management, to the notion of supply chain management, and when I think about where the accumulation of these various functional areas to where we are today, as a supply chain person, I frankly can't think of a more exciting time to be in our area of expertise, our domain. We have, in my opinion, entered another major domain and a gate for our future as a supply chain experts in our field. When I think about what I described early on was this notion of, supply chains. We are geared for creating value based on, either reliability or responsibly, matching supply and demand. And you think about the way our supply chains are designed, which are rooted with a forecast-driven mentality. If you think about where we're going with a demand-driven focus and agenda, it starts changing the notion of responding and operating with an execution lens to a strategic lens. And so, if I key in on 4 key takeaways from all of this, it creates an opportunity for supply chain practitioners and executives to be thinking about supply chain with a holistic perspective, thinking end-to-end. It's not just within your 4 walls of your business, but end-to-end from your suppliers, your suppliers' operations to your customers, ultimate customers, meeting customers' needs. It means, secondly, it also focuses in on not just cost. It is about understanding value and how value, either from a revenue and or enterprise standpoint, are affected as a result of what we do. It also centers on how you work, and so it's not just about executing your domain of focus, but how you work and connect with others in your business to break down the silos, to get the interconnected work, cultural breakdowns occurring to enable truly seamless business operations and supply chain being at the forefront of understanding. And lastly, I'd highlight the focus around, what we have and what's emerged here as a result of these drivers and these levers available to us, an opportunity to really define how a company operates. So the essence, last point I want to leave with you is the focus on how a company operates is driven based on how supply chain operates. And to make that transformational leap, staying focused on execution and operations is not going to get it there. It's going to require a strategic lens in how you operate and execute. So with that overview of our talk here, formal talk, Christopher, let's go back and open up for questions.
Absolutely, thank you. We've now saved some time for questions and answers, so as a reminder, type your question in the questions box at the right side of your screen and just click send, and we'll give you a few moments to ask some questions. All right, gentlemen, our first question comes in, and it is, what might you say about the e-business demand forecast?
I'm sorry, what was the question again?
That's all right. The question is, what do you have to say about the e-business demand forecast?
E-business demand forecast, I'd like to have better context of the question. We could follow up.
That's all right. If the person asking the question can maybe give a little more background or some information there, we'll get to that later. I'll move on to the next question then, and we'll loop around back. Next question is, under what conditions might you stop using a supplier?
Herb, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, absolutely. I think across the board we have we advocate a balanced scorecard with the suppliers, so it's not just cost, it's quality, it's delivery, it's responsiveness, et cetera. But I think there are many occasions where either an economic situation has driven a supplier to not be able to meet their quality demands, the responsiveness demands, et cetera. I think there are cases where suppliers have situations they just cannot, for various maybe capital influx reasons or maybe tier 2, tier 3 supplier reasons, they're not able to fulfill their responsibilities. I would say leading class organizations are integrated, and for those core and strategic suppliers, as you segment your suppliers, you're looking at those core suppliers and those strategic suppliers, and you're typically integrated, you're collaborating with them regularly, and you have a development program in place to help them be successful. In many other of the suppliers, you may be monitoring them very much on a cost, quality, delivery capability, and if they cannot meet those, then you're in a position to pretty readily replace those where appropriate.
All right, thank you. Our next question. It's hard to get my supply chain team to start thinking strategically instead of tactically. Do you have any tips for this?
I'd go back to well, first of all, let's just go back to the cultural, sort of our operating focus. All of us that are in operation supply chain have a tendency to focus on how we do what we do, the execution and so forth. And so I completely understand, even personally can relate to the challenge of becoming and evolving to more of a strategic thought, leader in what you do. But I'll come back to the key points that we highlighted in this discussion, and let me get to maybe another way to kind of think about this in your mind. Many times our ability to think strategically is rooted to our ability to answer why we do what we do. And I think that if we start really pushing a more purposeful focus around our agendas to understand the why of what we're all about, I think whether you're looking at in a planning function, whether you're a sourcing team, so that you allow your mind to get outside the focus of what you do day in, day out, but you allow yourself to kind of think about the purpose in the a longer-term perspective based on answering that question. So that's how I would respond to that, to the interesting question that was highlighted. Now, Herb, I don't know if there's any more you could add on that one.
No, I think that makes sense.
All right, great. Let's move right along here. So this question, let me see if I can phrase this properly. When planning for the unexpected, do you then perform a walkthrough of all parties, all the way from supplier to manufacturing to customer, to assist in this review or any other issues?
It depends. We have, and in fact, we typically we work with our teams looking at supply chain risk and understanding what's going on from a supply standpoint, all the way down to the the operations and delivery to customers. And for that matter, even looking at customers, you might be more reliant on certain customers that may have risk that you may not be aware of that could have another ripple effect back up into your supply chain. So it depends upon the scope of your area of responsibility, but also at what level. On an annual basis, typically the Treasury function runs an enterprise risk review, and that's done through the various functional leaders of a business. And I think that when we talk about looking at the unintended consequence supply chain, looking at it with a supply chain lens brings even a more broader and end-to-end point of view to the topic, which is a very natural aspect of what we're talking about doing here.
Yeah, Brian, I would add that if you think about a traditional organization, about 50% of revenue goes out the back door to third parties and the overall extended network that we've talked about today. But one of the things that we're seeing is the accumulation of those risks that we're talking about when it comes to third parties is really necessitating a holistic approach. So it's not just compliance, it's not just regulatory, it's not just product supply. It's all of those components around anti-bribery, green and sustainability, conflict minerals, child labor, potential black swan events in locations, et cetera, financial and capital, et cetera. And one of the things I think we're finding is that it can be those once-a-year events. It can be during those supplier reviews, et cetera, that we talked about earlier. But it also needs to be on everyone's desk and top of mind with everyone involved in the supply chain, because we as executives and as a key component in the overall supply chain need to be thinking and sensing, why is the supplier asking for this? What has changed since the last time we had this review, et cetera? And understanding and foreshadowing to some extent what could be and what the options are and what the negative consequences are that we talked about earlier, and monitoring those. A lot of moving parts.
All right, great. The next question is, at what point do you utilize backward integration in your supply chain?
When you say backward integration, help me better understand the question.
Okay. I was under the impression that was perhaps a phrase that had come up. But if the person can ask him, I can maybe offer a little more details about backward integration. Because personally, I'm not sure what that means either.
Not sure if that means.
But let's go back.
Or, yeah.
I wonder if that's reverse logistics or anything like that. But let's see if the person can maybe offer some more information.
Thank you.
So let me move on to the next question. In your years of experience, What are some of the more significant unexpecteds that you've come across?
What was the most significant unexpected?
That's right.
Yeah. Interesting enough, I think the most significant unexpected events I think deal with product development, and where capital gets hung up on the balance sheet. When you look at the tooling, you look at all the commitments that are being made when you're either in the product development process and/or as you get further along in the development process and getting it connected to supply chain operations, manufacturing, and so on. The biggest impact that I've been a part of, frankly, has been the product development side. Is number one. And in fact, in the study done by the professor I cited earlier, when you looked at, he did a study on these stock price valuation or impacts. That I recall that the magnitude of the change of deterioration in enterprise value was over 9% negative as a result of not missing a new product launch. But it's not just that. But if you look at the cost, you look at the capital that gets hung up. Getting that connectivity to me is important. A second to me, I'll highlight three. The second one is probably it occurs at this point when you have material shortages, where manufacturing, everyone's working at a pretty lean level of inventory levels, and when you have material misses in suppliers not meeting a demand or a planned order and delivering on time, is probably second. And then third is dealing with it doesn't hit immediately, but it has very significant impacts, which is dealing with non-service level performance. When I'm amazed at certain companies that are measuring service levels and they're in the sub 70% delivery expectations of whatever sort of promise that they've given, without going back and changing that. That has just a huge impact. And again, if you make it hard for your customers to do business with you, someone else is going to find it. They're going to find someone that's easier to do business with, and they'll seek that out.
Thank you. So this next question is actually a clarification about the earlier e-business question. So in the e-business world, you're enabled to have better knowledge of your consumer preferences and behaviors. Does this enable better forecast accuracy?
Actually, first of all, the answer to the question is, to some extent, it gets a better profile, I think, of demand. I think forecast accuracy today is still, this is a bit of a Pandora box. Forecasting to me is a very difficult thing to be able to be good at in anything you do. I think it's a matter because it depends upon the variability of demand. But the characteristics of the demand and better understand, the e-business world, if you will, if you look at what is evolving as a result of the data that's being captured on customers of particularly, I'll use consumer products as a focused industry here, you begin to start shaping the demand of the product strategies and/or the triggers for sales and other aspects that create, the matching of a product with customers. And but relative to forecasting, I'm not sure I would ascertain that that's driving more effective forecasting, because forecasting itself is very difficult. It's more about how then you create agile and adaptable supply chains to be able to, and be able to capture those maybe new segments and/or better understand how to service those segments and match the product specifications to those customer segment needs. That's how I would answer that.
Yeah, Brian, I would jump in with one additional thought, which is I think the capabilities and the trends that we see in B2B in B2C always tend to evolve to B2B at some point in time. So as we think about e-business between two enterprises from a B2B perspective, I think we will, in the supply chain, continue to see some of those similar capabilities from B2C coming over. So examples, how would something like Groupon or crowdsourcing start to change how we do supply management if I'm a supplier either at Tier 1 or Tier 2 and I have significant overcapacity at some point? Maybe my customer in the B2B world would decide to up their inventory capability in order to take advantage of a specific price reduction, et cetera. Maybe I could start looking at crowdsourcing capabilities in order to manage the network to meet fluctuating demand or seasonal demand in a different way than what we do today. So those concepts aren't completely embedded in B2B now, but I think some of those same concepts with a little different flavor will come at us in the supply chain and in the B2B world of the future.
Okay, thank you. And I had another forecast question lined up, but I think you kind of covered it. So I think we're going to have to cut it right there. And I apologize if we didn't get to any of your questions, but I think we went through quite a bit there. I'd like to thank Brian and Herb for their time today, and thank you for sharing with us your thoughts and your ideas based on your experience. So this concludes today's edition of APICS Extra Live. All content and materials included in this edition of APICS Extra Live are the property of APICS and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved. Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Until next time.